Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today we're going to look at a couple of my mini Phalaenopsis orchids in my collection. First of all, these 4 orchids are grocery store orchids and they do not have any IDs, but the reason I purchased them was because they all had some unique characteristics which I like in orchids, and they weren't expensive at all. They were maybe $6.99 or $5.99 each. It was very inexpensive. So when you come across cute orchids that you like, that you know will bring you joy, and you can afford them, always get 2. And these are the photos of the blooms. Initially I bought 3 and I gave 1 to a friend of mine and I kept 2. So we're gonna start with these 2 orchids, and then there are 2 other orchids that I want to talk to you about. So toward the end of summer 2019, these orchids were still doing pretty well. They were growing leaves, they were growing roots, and because they were in active growth, so I really took about 2 weeks to decide if I want to repot them right away or I should just let them be for a while. And in the end, as you can see, I decided to not repot these orchids and just let them grow however they want. Also, because at that time it was at the end of summer, but because I live in the southern part of the US, end of September, it was still relatively warm, so I decided to do a couple of things to these orchids. Number 1, I did not repot them, but number 2, I actually increased the frequency of my watering for these 2 orchids. So each time I gave them about 1/4 cup of water, and that's the typical amount that I give to most of my orchids. But for these 2, in around midweek, if I see that they are somewhat dry, I would give them another 1/8 of a cup during midweek. And for this 1/8 of a cup, I also include 25% fertilizer. So weekly watering, I always give 1/4 strength fertilizer. So during the midweek, they get some water plus the same amount of the same strength of fertilizer. So these 2 orchids receive additional water and additional fertilizer because they were in such active growth, and because my environment, the weather condition was still pretty good. It was warm, high humidity, and of course I had to give them additional ventilation just to make sure that they're okay and not rotting. Now, during those 2 weeks, what was I doing? I was observing. I was actively observing the moss, as well as trying to see if there is any bugs or pests or mealybugs, just to make sure, because I've decided not to repot them, so I really took my time to see if there's any reason that I should repot them. Because sometimes when new orchids come into your environment, what's inside the media, you can't always be sure. So in a way, I took my time, but then it was still always a gamble. But in the end, I decided that they were okay. So what I have done is, when I need to give them water, I put them in these little tiny plastic cup, and then I pour the 1/4 cup of water in there, let them soak up all the water, and then I will put the orchid along with the moss, right? Pick it up and put it back into the pink ceramic pot. End of October 2019, they were still growing strong. Roots are getting longer, and the new leaves got bigger, and the interesting thing here is the newer leaf bears darker pigments, and I think as the leaf grow out and mature, the modeling actually would get a little, I think it would fade out a little. And the new leaves also, the back side of it also has quite a lot of purple pigmentation. And that's something that all its previous leaves do not have. So I wonder it has to do with, the way that my environment is. Maybe it's additional sunlight, additional temperature that caused that color to come out. Either way, I think it's interesting. Now, lots of roots were coming out of the media, and I just kind of let them grow freely. And now came end of December 2019, they were still doing pretty well. The new leaves were pretty much as big, if not bigger, than its previous leaves. So I know these two orchids were doing superb. And these roots, yes, they are growing really unruly, but they're okay. And if I decide to repot them in the coming spring, I have a lot more roots to work with. I didn't want to repot them because the media looked okay and there was no pest and they were in active growth. I know many of you, including myself, sometimes would really feel the urge to repot a new orchid. Sometimes that actually do more harm than good. And that's why a lot of my new orchid hobbyists on my channel, they would tell me, my orchid bloomed once and then the next year it doesn't bloom. And then, sometimes we talked about it. Sometimes it's care, sometimes it's because they were set back after the immediate repot. Now, this third orchid is the same kind as the previous two. However, this was purchased a couple weeks later at the same grocery store. But this one obviously did not have very good root system. I could tell as soon as I took away the film cup. And this time I decided that I want to use a media. So typically for orchid with this kind of root condition, I would use water culture to at least try to get a couple of new healthy roots before I repot it into any kind of method with media. But this time it's kind of a gamble, really. And the reason I say it's kind of a gamble, because once the roots are potted, they're in the media. You can't really see how the roots are doing. So that's why I decided to drill additional holes on the sides as well as at the bottom. So essentially, this one really is a traditional growing method with drainage holes at the bottom. The only difference is that instead of using moss or bark chips, for example, I'm using inorganic media. So this is a mixture of manto clay, the small ones, and then the big one is called hydrocorn. Hydrocorn is different than leca beads. Leca beads are perfectly round, and hydrocorn, they all have that irregular round ball shape that sometimes, supposedly would hold additional moisture, and because they're irregular, they look more interesting to me. But if you like that consistent look and feel of leca beads, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just really a matter of personal preference. Another consideration I had with this orchid was because I couldn't see the roots, so I knew I had to be really careful about the amount of water I provide to this orchid, even though between pebbles there is enough air, hopefully. There is enough air, there is aeration. It's not compacted like moss, if you will. However, I decided that I wanted to drill holes at the bottom, but with the combination of inner and outer cup, I can sometimes let some water remain at the bottom, so that's a hybrid of semi-hydro. But sometimes if I decide that it's too humid, I want this orchid to drain, to not have any additional water, I can do that, because this double cup method gives me that flexibility. And here the outer cup is just to prevent algae formation. And the fourth orchid, the last orchid of this video, is a white Phalaenopsis orchid, also a mini. This is what the flower looks like. This orchid, when it first came to my house, had many bud blasts. it was just so sensitive to my environment. But that's okay. The reason I bought this orchid was not because of its flower, because it was just typical white mini phalaenopsis orchid, but for its leaves. Its leaves has some recessive mottling on it, which I love. And toward the end of the year, two new leaves have grown and they were much bigger. And I also see signs of active root growth. I did repot this orchid with new moss, and because it's such a small, like 1-inch film cup, that I actually packed this moss slightly firmer than I would normally with other orchids, because I know this orchid has good root system, and with that amount of moss it would get dry out really quickly, so it was okay for me to do so. But all in all, this fourth orchid was looking pretty good and was doing relatively well. So all of these orchids, I am hopeful that in 2020 it will have a good growing season and potentially rebloom for us. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!